Hello and welcome to the CNBC-TV18 special. We continue to come to you from Davos 2023. I'm Shireen Bhan and we're joined now by the top team at McKinsey to get us a view of what McKinsey makes of the year ahead, not just for India, but for Asia. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Gautam, let me start by asking you, I'll get to India in a bit, but let's talk about the region. This seems to be the island of optimism, so to speak, in this uncertain global environment.
I think that is true. In fact, on Monday I had the privilege of hosting about 90 senior executives from Asia, and I must say that it was far from gloom and doom. I think the reality is, if you look at it in the short term, I think the world is optimistic about what developing markets in Asia will do. I think certainly the expectation is hopefully twice as better growth rate compared to the OECD world. I think if you look at, there are many bright spots. I know we're going to talk about India later, but I'd add Indonesia, I'd add Vietnam, I'd add, even Japan is resurging, and I think the Korean economy is as well, despite the challenges asserting on a global stage. So I think there is reason for optimism. The demographics are strong. I think you look at the consumption, half of the consumption is coming from this part of the world. So I would say, yes, there is perhaps, of course, there's concern about the storm coming and the impact it'll have, but I would say there's certainly enough tailwinds to battle some of the headwinds.
I want to pick up on what you said about the region and the kind of opportunity as well as the excitement that we're seeing, especially on the manufacturing side in countries like Vietnam, etc. And I'll ask you this in the context of India, because everyone's talking about supply chain resilience and, where are you going to build out? India is one of the destinations, but countries like Vietnam have actually taken a large part of the share. What's working there?
Yeah. Look, as you can imagine, I think at the end of the day, people will vote with their feet. I think there is a competition amongst countries going on at this time. I think the tailwinds certainly support many markets in Asia. I think if you look at Vietnam in particular, has just done a great job of, I think, creating the right ecosystem and creating the right compelling cost and reliable supply chain infrastructure to deliver on global requirements. And I think that's where India has to catch up, frankly. I think. What
is the difference in terms of cost competitiveness between Indonesia and India, for instance?
Well, if I just
Vietnam. Sorry.
No, look, we did some numbers. The reality is that there is a 10-15% disadvantage. I think when you look at the high cost of energy, the logistics cost, I think, and frankly, some of the inefficiencies in the labor markets, I think it does cost 10-15% disadvantage. I'm very excited about what the government has done recently with PLI schemes and everything else, and I think those kinds of efforts and combined with the Indian entrepreneurship, I have no doubt we can move. We just love for it to move faster.
Yes, that is the hope, certainly at this point in time. You didn't talk about China, though, but that's emerging as the big X factor in conversations here in Davos.
It is certainly the X factor. I think one thing we can say for sure is that, look, the good old days of 8, 10, 12% growth are gone. I think no one is expecting, even as China bounces back, I think most people expect that to be somewhere between 2 to 5%, right? The most optimistic 5, perhaps the most pessimistic 2. Now, that's not a small number, by the way, when you put that in the context of a scale of Chinese economy. And in fact, depending on how rapidly it comes back on stage, I think it'll probably have a global impact on inflation and commodity and input prices. But China is too big to ignore. I think I say that as a proud Indian, but China is too big to ignore. And I think you have to decide, are you going to go all in, are you going to exit, or are you going to find a middle path?
Let me get Rajat to comment on that. And Rajat, I think that's part of the conversation that's happening as well at this point, that, China continues to be investable. And the argument that we were going to see an anywhere but China strategy play out, I'm not getting that sense here in Davos. Is that accurate? Is that what you're hearing as well?
Absolutely accurate. I think the decoupling scenario that the world will move totally away from China is just not feasible, just not practical. I would use the word diversification. I think all the multinationals, all the global companies, governments are looking at China plus, and I think there are various shades of that have been discussed industry by industry, but as China returns back to normalcy, and that's a clear scenario in the next 6 months, I think it'll come back with a lot of force and momentum. Equally, I think the companies have learned their lesson and they will absolutely diversify their supply chains.
Let's talk about India now. Sure. And of course, clear consensus. It's a compelling story at this point in time, the bright spot that everybody is talking about. Those invested believe that this is time to go all in. Those looking and waiting on the sidelines are also hopeful of being able to get in. What is the sense that you get from the conversations that you're having?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Shireen, is this a time when ordinary change is happening? I absolutely don't think so. I think we are at the cusp of a new era. We're absolutely at the cusp of a new era because the kind of forces that are now shaping the response of the CEOs and the opportunities they're opening up, we see in our conversations with promoters and CEOs in India, they're getting very much more decisive. After battling with crisis after crisis in the last 3-4 years, they're getting very decisive. If I look at the forces at work, I think 2 of the Ds are, I mentioned decoupling or diversification in the supply chains opening up, decarbonization. These are global forces. I would call out 3 forces that are very unique to India. I would say our demographics is a huge positive. The income demographics in the next 2 or 3 decades are going to be very favorable. Young population, rising incomes, which leads to a tremendous amount of domestic consumption. The second, I would say, is digitization. Big deal. Both on the end of digital consumption, could be $1 trillion opportunity by 2030. And then we look at the back end of it, all the delivery of digital skills, not just in India, but globally, with 20% of working age population coming out of India in 2 decades, is just a humongous opportunity for India, which is uniquely placed. And finally, I would actually echo what Gautam said, distinctive entrepreneurship culture. Great ambitions by the promoter class. And I think that's where the decisiveness is coming. And if I look at $4 trillion opportunities in the coming 5 years for India Inc., right? Number 1, decarbonization. Look at both offense and defense, not just about somehow meeting the net zero goal, but get into business building. EVs, renewables, green hydrogen. Many of these business cases are in the money or will get in the money. So it's a huge opportunity. It's $1 trillion opportunity. Digital consumption, I mentioned, is $1 trillion opportunity. We have about 160 million transactions annually, could get to about 700-800 million transactions annually by 2030, so huge opportunity. I think the dislocating supply chains, big opportunity. We have 10 specific supply chains where manufacturing value chains where India could specialize. Some of them have to be seeded new, be it solar panels and renewables, electronics, and so on, and so aerospace and defense. These are the sorts of opportunities that, frankly, India Inc. is really posed with. And I'm glad to say that India is indeed the bright spot because many of the companies are making the bold moves.
Yamito, let me address the region question with you before I talk about the big opportunity on the sustainability side, because that's one of the opportunities that both Gautam and Rajat just identified. But Japan and Korea specifically as well, you know, Gautam talked about Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. Japan and Korea, what's the sense that you get there?
I think there's a lot of optimism, actually, and also a sense of urgency to move on, actually. And when I looked at the Japanese and Korean companies, they are both looking for sustainable opportunities. And we talked about the United States when we have the Inflation Reduction Act. That's a huge market open opportunity. And that's like reducing hydrogen and batteries with 30%. It's a huge market opening. And we actually saw that the foreign direct investment towards the United States in the 4th quarter of 2022 jumped up. And guess what? When we look into it, it's actually the Korean companies investing into the batteries, and they have won actually historical first time over Japan. But the Japanese companies are trying to catch up with that kind of notion as well. So there is, you know, an appetite of change from the defense side to the offense side. And that's what I saw in the optimism coming out here in Davos discussing with these companies as well.
You know, so let me end by asking each one of you, because that's a good point that you mentioned there, Yamito, that this is an opportunity where many companies will need to play on the offense as opposed to defensive. But this is also an environment where interest rates have risen. It's an uncertain climate. How easy or difficult is it going to be to take those big bets in an environment like this? What's the indication that you get from the boardrooms that you speak to?
I think, look, I think every time we're in the middle of a crisis, I think there are challenges. I think at this time we are certainly headed for an era which seems like it's going to be higher inflation for quite some time and higher interest rates. But I think those are the rules of the game. I think to me, in any of these eras, I think we've seen the difference between people who have played, I think, more offense and defense and others that haven't. So the sense is, if you go back to what happened after the global financial crisis, Shireen, we looked at this data and we found that folks that actually moved offensively did much better in terms of return to shareholders than others who cramped down. So this is the time when I think you will have to make bold moves. You will have to make bold moves, not just, for example, building new businesses. We talked about sustainability, building digital businesses. Equally on defense. You know, how can you take your R&D productivity up 20%? How can you take another bite and, you know, digitally enable your entire value chain? So when we say defense and offense, I think it should really raise the resilience of companies. I have zero doubt that you're going to see bigger separation bigger separation between the best and the below average performing players. That's happened in every crisis, and I think it's going to happen over the next many years.
The winning mindset at play, Rajat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let me add it from the sources of capital perspective. Quick couple of comments. I mean, if you look at the Indian corporate sector, 70% of the funding comes from domestic financial institutions and banks. That number in the developed world is only 30%. 70% money comes from foreign capital, private capital. India has only 20% share of the private capital flows that get into Asia. Could easily be 40%, right? And the FDI phenomenon in India is beginning to show that if there are right, there's a right conducive business environment, there are positive business cases, then money will come in. In renewables, money is coming in. Manufacturing, if I just dice up the $84 billion of FDI reported last year, the manufacturing piece of it has gone up from 12 billion to about 21, 22 billion. So needle is moving. And I think the foreign capital is the one that needs to be brought in with conducive policies.
Well, we hope that the foreign capital does make its way into India, and we hope that many of the issues that we spoke of and the areas of potential and promise are realized over the next few years. Gautam, Rajat, Yumito, many, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18 at Davos. Appreciate your time, and we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will take a break here, but continue our conversations at Davos 2023. We're back in a moment with more. Stay tuned.